In need of a good read or just want to keep up with the books everyone's talking about? NPR's Book of the Day podcast gives you today's very best writing in a pocket-sized show. Whether you're looking to engage with the big questions of our times or temporarily escape from them, we've got an author who'll speak to you. Catch today's great books in 15 minutes or less on the Book of the Day podcast, only from NPR.
Hey, it's Tali, here to tell you about the podcast Israel Story. Now, more than ever, Israel is a tough topic. Some love it, others hate it, but Israel Story offers a nuanced, faithful window into the extraordinary stories of everyday people in Israel. Beautiful and ugly, tragic and inspiring, ridiculous and heartwarming. Check out hundreds of timeless episodes in their back catalog or dive into the 65 Wartime Diaries episodes capturing slivers of life right now. Hear voices from soldiers to survivors, farmers to rabbis, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and connect with this complicated, amazing place. Hosted by Mishi Harman and produced with the Jerusalem Foundation and the Times of Israel, find Israel Story wherever you get your podcasts. Welcome to the 5 Books, where each week we will talk with a Jewish author about 5 books that are near and dear to them. Join us to connect with your favorite author and to find your next great read. We'll talk about how books influence our lives and identities, and we hope to add more texture to what you know of the Jewish experience. My name is Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen. I'm a book lover and former literary agent who has a special place in my heart for Jewish books. Each week, we'll talk with Jewish authors about 5 books in 5 categories. We'll hear about 2 Jewish books that have impacted the author's Jewish identity. We'll hear about 1 book, not necessarily Jewish, that they think everyone should read, a book that changed their worldview. We'll get a peek into what book the author is reading now, and we'll get to hear about the new book they've just published and how it came about. Today, we'll be talking with Yael van der Wouden about her new novel, The Safekeep.
It's not exactly magic, and it's not exactly mysticism, but there is a ghost.
Yael lives in the Netherlands, where she lectures in creative writing and comparative literature. The Safekeep is her first novel and was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. The Safekeep opens in 1961 in a quiet rural Dutch province. Isabel lives alone in her late mother's country home, guided by routine and discipline. All is upended when her brother brings his graceless new girlfriend Ava, leaving her at Isabel's doorstep as a guest to stay for the season. Mysterious, sophisticated, and sensual, The Safekeep shines a light into the shadowy corners of our histories and homes, exposing the unexpected facets of revenge and redemption. Yael will share some of the Jewish books that shaped her, like Jonathan Safranfoer's Everything is Illuminated.
It made me realize that Jewishness in literature could be interesting.
We'll also hear about Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik.
I felt like I was a kid again reading that book, and I got to read something that I'd wanted to read for many, many years.
And we'll understand what it's like for Yael to have grown up Jewish and Dutch in the Netherlands.
There's all these synagogues, right? And there's Yiddish. A lot of Yiddish has filtered through into the Dutch language. And sort of like there's these remnants. I call them bones. I just, growing up here, felt like a ghost. I felt like I was something that was haunting. I felt like, that my culture was no longer present, but I was.
That's all coming up next. Yael, welcome to the 5 Books. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
I'm super excited to talk about this book. This is a book that really stayed with me, lives on in my waking and sleeping life. I'm just curious. It's gotten such incredible reviews. It's been shortlisted for the Booker Prize. How is it feeling with it out in the world and all of this attention?
This will be very surprising to hear. Probably you won't expect it, but quite overwhelming. Yeah.
I am curious, and maybe I should know this, but what language do you write in?
English.
English, which is not your first language.
It is. It is.
Oh.
That would be a feat if it wasn't my first language. No.
Okay, remind me. You were born Where?
I was born in Tel Aviv.
Okay.
And my dad is Dutch and my mom's Israeli. And my dad's Hebrew is fantastic for somebody who's not a native speaker. And my mom's Dutch is also fantastic for somebody who's not a native speaker. However, when they communicate, rather than go to the effort of having to reach into their depth to speak the language that they've learned, they just go for English because they're both quite fluent. So I grew up between their two Englishes, where they both speak different kinds of English, but it's still in English. And then Hebrew was what I heard at school and from my mom. And then we moved to the Netherlands when I was 11. And then Dutch was my third language. So it's English, Hebrew, Dutch. That's the order.
So I'm curious, especially with the book that you've written, if you could take me back a little bit of your family's story.
Yes. So I grew up in Tel Aviv, in Ramat Gan, really, and lived there with my parents and my two sisters and two dogs and whatever other pets came our way, which I would... There's this one memory. I'm laughing because I tried to write a story about this several times, and it's just like, it's too weird to write a story about. But the short version is that I went to a very hippie school. It was called the Open Democratic School. And one of our classes was zoo classes, where we went to the zoo once a week and helped take care of the animals. And then one week we had to feed the snakes. And then, there was a mouse that had to be fed to a snake. And I, in all my, I think 9-year-old fury, was like, you must not murder the little mouse. And the guy who worked there was like, listen, either I feed it to the snake, or we have too many mice. Like, what do you want to do? Do you want to take it home? And I was like, I shall take it home. And I took it home. And for one day, I was the most popular girl in the class, which was something that really it had been an issue for me. It was something that had kept me up a night before, not the life of mice, but rather my own position in the social dynamic of a 9-year-old at school. I could never figure out why I didn't have more friends, or the friends that I did have, why they didn't seem to sort of like want to hang out with me as much as I wanted to hang out with them. And then for that one day, sort of all that war was gone. Everybody seemed to like me. And so I was determined to hold on to the mouse forever. And then, I took it home and presented it to my terrified parents, who were like, well, fine, I guess you'll have to take care of it. And then, but because of the mouse, I was then invited to a birthday party of a girl who had not sort of even acknowledged me before. And then when I showed up at the party, she was like, where's the mouse? And I was like, well, I didn't bring the mouse. I thought you invited me. And she was like, I thought you would bring the mouse. And the entire evening, everybody at the party just kept on asking about the mouse. And I had this realization that it wasn't me who was popular, but rather like the mouse.
I can see how you tried to write that as a story. That is a wild story.
Yeah, and I have not found a format to it yet. This is not an answer to your question at all, but this is just to give you an insight, maybe. But yeah, my parents are both artists, so maybe you get sort of the image together with a slightly hippie school, right? Art was always first and foremost in our household. And then in 1997. My parents decided to move to the Netherlands because my father is, of course, Dutch. And it was very shocking to me. Okay, yet again, I thought that what would happen is that we were going to move and that we were going to move to Europe. But I thought it would be just cute outfits and perhaps dreamy snow, which I'd never seen before. And that I would get to reinvent myself as a fancy new person and maybe once and for all find my popularity. But no, I was just the biggest weirdo here, more so than in Israel. And that was the start of a whole new journey.
Nothing makes a writer more than feeling like an outsider, right?
Unfortunately, it wouldn't be amazing if you're just like having a great time in high school made for a fantastic author.
Yeah, exactly. And tell me about your mom's background.
So her mother, it's a bit of a complicated story, but I think most Jewish histories don't walk a straight line generally. Her mother was born in Vienna, but her parents, once again, are from Ukraine, Poland, and Romania. And my grandfather, so my mother's father, he was born, and his family came from Sofia, from Bulgaria. What I always think is very interesting about that history is that every single one of my grandparents was born in a different country, and some of them on a different continent from one another. And that if you look at the history of my families, a lot of them also didn't speak each other's languages necessarily. I'm always fascinated by that because I think it's hard enough to find love when you do speak each other's language. And how hard must it be to still, or how, like, what a testament perhaps to love that you still find each other despite language barriers and cultural barriers and all of that. I mean, my parents, right? They found their lingua franca in English. So perhaps there is something to be said for it.
Book 1, A Jewish Book from Childhood. Everything is Illuminated by Jonathan Safran Foer. First, I'm curious to hear a little bit about what you were like as a reader, as a kid.
As a kid, I was not... I was not a reader at all, actually. That period that I was talking about with the mouse and the snake and all that was... I was really preoccupied with social dynamics, and that took up a lot of my time. That and just like general art. I was a messy kid, and I was either playing outside. My girlfriend always calls this attitude that kids sometimes have as making something happen. So to this kids that always want to sort of, they want something to happen. They want to sort of come up with a project, or they want to come up with some kind of scheme so that they can earn money and then buy candy. I was one of the sort of very eager, make it happen kids. And then we moved to the Netherlands. And for the first 3 months that we lived here, we lived with my grandparents, who had a beautiful house in a very forested area in the Netherlands in the east, a cabin bungalow in the woods. And I was really bored. Yeah, I was trying to find ways to entertain myself, I suppose. And out of desperation, I eventually turned to the books that my mom had brought with her. Before we came here, she asked that friend to put a little pile together for me. So she must have had some kind of idea of the boredom that I might face in the woods. And the first book that I read was The Secret Garden. I think it was immediate. I think I disappeared into that world. I was entranced.
It's a conversion experience.
Yeah.
Okay, so at what point did you pick up Everything is Illuminated?
You asked childhood, but there were I think near to no books with any Jewish themes that I read throughout my childhood, really, which I think leaned into my sense of loneliness in the Netherlands. I mean, there's Anne Frank's diary, of course, but that was definitely not a story I wanted to see myself in, and especially because I was reminded time and time again by kids in my class that I looked a lot like Anne Frank when I was 12, and I wanted to disassociate myself with her. And I also thought, because this was 1997, it was just around the time where Harry Potter was getting big, and all these, not just Harry Potter, right? Everybody was reading books about magic, and it was very sort of Christian centered. It was like the magic was magic, but it was still sort of steep in Christian symbolism and Christian language, right? Whenever there would be like special spells, they would be in Latin. I felt that my Jewishness was extremely boring and had nothing to do with magic. In the Harry Potter books, which is a whole other can of worms, but still, at the time, right, I would look for the Jewishness within them. I think there was one character who had a Jewish name, and I think it was Anthony Goldstein. And I would always sort of look out for is Anthony Goldstein going to be mentioned in this sort of grand theme? And is he going to have any kind of storyline? Of course not. But yeah, I was very happy sort of later on in life to learn that there was so much magic in Jewish mysticism and all of that. And I've played with that as well in writing. But at the time, had no clue. Everything's Illuminated came to me quite late in life. I think I was 18. And that was the first novel I read that was about Jewishness and that was about Jewish memory and Jewish life. And it was very funny and strange. I definitely read it through a different lens now than I did back then, but it opened a gate for me, and it made me realize, and I know this is silly to say, because of course, this feels very obvious, but it made me realize that Jewishness in literature could be interesting. Even though it is, the story is about the war, that it didn't only have to be about the war, that it could be about histories, and it could be about identity beyond Jewishness, sort of like it could be about just a character who struggles with themselves in many ways and struggles with love, and that character can be Jewish, but that the Jewishness is not central to who they are, but it's still a very sort of formative part of how you get to read them. And I didn't know that was possible before I read that book. It's as if somebody told me, like, you can write about yourself and your own heritage, and you can write about magic, and you can write about history, and all of those things can come together on the page. They don't have to be separate.
It's interesting you said something, even though it was about the war, and I know I've read your incredible essay on not reading Anne Frank. It seems like it was something you were kind of trying to avoid in some ways.
Yes, yeah. Also, before I wrote the Safekeep, one of the things I would repeat to anyone who would ask is, I'm never going to write a book about the Holocaust, because I am a firm believer that there's more to me than that history, and there's more to Jewishness than circling around that trauma. And of course, to be informed by it, to be shaped by it. But I didn't want to write something that stared at it and only at that. And then I went ahead and wrote the Safekeep, and then I was like, oh, well, I guess...
well,
I guess there's irony there.
Well, I think, and that's in the essay also, it's just how inescapable it is, right? And like the repercussions are inescapable.
It's inescapable. I think that's also kind of like the essay is also about what it's like to exist in the Netherlands as a Jewish person, and also as a visibly Jewish person, somebody who people look at and would usually just within a few seconds know, okay, that girl's Jewish. And what that essay was about is about how what it's like to live in a country where you're visibly Jewish, but at the same time your history has been erased in one way or another, because there's all these synagogues, right? And there's Yiddish. A lot of Yiddish has filtered through into the Dutch language, and there's habits, rituals that the Dutch have. For example, they eat matzahs with Easter. And sort of like there's these remnants. I call them bones. There's the bones of the people, but not the actual people themselves. They're gone. And I just, growing up here, felt like a ghost. I felt like I was something that was haunting. I always felt like, that my culture was no longer present, but I was some kind of remnant, strange remnant of something that used to be. And so it was inevitable for me to write about it in that way, because I am the ghost, right? I am the haunting. I am I am the haunting in that way.
On Death, Sex, and Money, we feature interviews with you, our community of listeners, getting honest about uncomfortable things.
I developed an illness where it isn't safe for me to drive. A friend once said to me, sex is like air. You don't think about it until you're not getting enough. This is a similar sort of thing if you just replace sex with driving.
Listen to Death, Sex, and Money wherever you get podcasts.
Book 2, A Jewish Book from Adulthood. The Ministry of Special Cases by Nathan Englander and Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik.
both of them changed my relationship to Jewish literature in different ways. I couldn't pick. Nathan Englander's novel shook me to the core, really. It's beautiful. I mean, he's a beautiful author, writer. There's hilarity to the opening parts of it, right? This man who, for a living, right, what does he do? He sneaks into graveyards and etches the names off of graveyards of people who don't want to be associated with those names. And there's something very sort of old world and unlikely and magical about that. And then it devolves into the dirty war in Argentina and about the loss of a child. And specifically, what really, really stayed with me about that book is the whole through line. And if you haven't read this book and you want to read it and you don't want to be spoiled, now is the moment to turn down the volume for a second. But the through line of when the parents try to look for their son who's been disappeared, but one of the payments that they have accepted in exchange for clearing the names off of graveyard stones was nose jobs. And so the parents now have these smooth, straight noses, small noses. And so when they go to the police with a photo of their son, the police can say time and again, like, this is not your son because you have a completely different face. He doesn't have your nose. This cannot be your son. And there's this something that happens there that makes you feel like through that surgery, they have lost their ability to sort of show that there is a connection there. And the reason why this was impactful for me as well is because, and I feel quite shallow in saying this, but for a long time as a teen, all I wanted was a nose job eventually, because I felt too obvious and too obviously Jewish, right? With the nose that I have. That was sort of a preoccupation. It was something that I was always thought that I was going to get when I would get older and I would have my own money. And then I read that book. I think I was 20, 21. And I think overnight, something about me just switched entirely. And it wasn't just sort of like, oh no, I must not touch my nose in case, something terrible happens to my parents. Like it wasn't sort of a one-on-one, but rather sort of like a deeper reflection on what it meant to have internalized, certain those Western white beauty standards, but also very specifically sort of the underlying anti-Semitism of sort of how we talk about noses, and especially sort of for Jewish women and their noses, and what I would be rejecting of myself, and especially sort of with the history of my family, my grandparents who had to both flee, and what they had to flee from, and what narrative would I be stepping into if I had that corrective surgery.
That's such a fascinating takeaway. Yeah, it sounds like it cemented something about your identity for you. Yes.
Again, feels I don't talk about this often because it's something I kind of also forgotten about. But then when it's interesting. You can just be obsessed with something for so many years and then just kind of forget about it from the one day to the other when it's no longer relevant to you. But when I saw the question of what would be my pick, it was almost immediate Nathan Englander and Naomi Novik for. Right. Well, we were talking about that magic, what that little girl wanted. Just to be clear, the little girl was me, right? That was fully and completely answered in Spinning Silver. And I read it a few years ago for the first time, not that long ago. But I felt like I was like a kid again reading that book, and I got to read something that I'd wanted to read for many, many years. And I've been trying to make everybody read it since, and people are being very stubborn. I don't know why they're being stubborn about it. I think it's a perfect December read. It's also incredibly cozy and, terrifying as it should be. But it was all the magic that I wish I'd had as a teenager that I then got to relive through Novik's work.
I'm just curious. I'm sure you had, you've encountered, you said, other Jewish mysticism, Jewish magical sort of idea. So what was it about this story or how it was told for you?
I mean, it's a retelling of Rumpelstiltskin through a Jewish lens, where sort of the whole story of Rumpelstiltskin is turned upon its head, sort of who's asking for gold and what. And of course, there's that really interesting element that you can then explore, which is stereotypes around Jewishness and the having of gold and all of that. It makes use of Jewish mysticism on the one hand, but on the other hand, it also leans on a lot of other non-Jewish fairy tales and histories of talking about magic. And I'd never seen anyone do that before. I'd never seen anybody be so swift and so light and so generous, really, with their view of both magic and Jewishness. And nothing felt heavy-handed. And it just felt like you were invited to come into this world of magic rather than you were being told a story in a very pointed way.
I love that. I think a lot of people will maybe want to pick up the book now with your description.
I hope so.
Yeah.
It's fantastic.
My husband always points out that abracadabra is avra-cadabra.
Sure
Hebrew
is.
For
Yeah.
I will create. Book 3, A Book That Changed Your Worldview. In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado.
It's hard to say about this one if everybody should read it. I don't know if it's for everyone. But I do think that a lot of people should read it. Yet again, I think I just picked books that made me go, I didn't know we were allowed to do this. I didn't know that we could do this. It's a memoir in name, but not necessarily in form. Have you read it, Tali? No. Oh, you should absolutely read it. It reinvents the memoir in that it recounts an experience of an abusive relationship where their abusive relationship mostly sort of was centered, what happened within a house. And this is the dream house, right? And within those walls of the dream house, the abusive relationship unfolds. And the reason why this is so fascinating is that, and so beautiful, is that every chapter is told through a different genre. So you have the dream house as a neo-noir novel, the dream house as a romantic comedy, the dream house as a choose your own adventure. And it's also one of the only works that I've read that shows abusive relationship within queer relationship. And I'd never read I never read a memoir like that because I don't think anybody had ever written a memoir like that. I finished that that book, and I thought to myself, I need to make sure that I never do any of this, that I never become the perpetrator, that I never, without fully understanding that I manipulate within a relationship. Reading it and seeing sort of how seamless sometimes the abuser in the relationship goes from just arguing her case to just, and then it switches and it sort of heightens, and before you know it, she's accusing the main character of ridiculous things, and then there's chairs being thrown, and that gentle, the sort of very sort of gradual growth from just arguing to abuse is shown in a way that I'd never seen before, and it really frightened me. Not that I think that I'm close to that, or that I've been guilty of that, but rather just the knowledge of right, this is how you, without maybe even realizing it yourself, can become a perpetrator. And this is also something that for me was really central in writing the Safekeep, is what small things need to happen in your life that make you complicit in something larger without you even realizing it.
Book 4, the book you're reading now, The Artist by Lucy Steeds.
If you've read the Safekeep and you like hot summers, you like people stuck in a house together, and you like the way that Lucy puts it is fruits and freaks, then you would love The Artist. It's about a young journalist who in the 1920s goes and searches for the French artist that he's been obsessed with his whole life, and finds him in this large house in the south of France. And it is exciting, it's thrilling, there's historical cameos, and it is incredibly romantic too.
Book 5, the author's latest novel, Yael van der Wouden's The Safekeep. I think we're going to give a note to listeners that if they haven't read The Safekeep, they absolutely need to do so, and they should come back and listen to the rest of the conversation, because I do want to get into being able to discuss the book in full, and I think there will be some spoilers.
Yes.
So
pause the podcast and read the entire book in one sitting, and then come back.
You will read the entire book in one sitting. We've been talking a lot about houses and homes, and came up in a few of the books we've talked about so far. And just given what you said, it was so fascinating to me about each of your grandparents coming from a different country and different languages. Curious what home means to you, or how you think about home.
I think that I'm still in the process of figuring this out. For a long time, I thought that there was going to be a moment where I would go to a city or I would go to a country, and that there would be like this aha moment. I'd be like, yes, this is where I want to land. I mean, for all of my young years in adulthood here in the Netherlands, I knew that I didn't want to stay here necessarily. I thought there was going to be another place for me. And everywhere I went, there was never, that feeling never came. And whenever I would go, because I have been away for longer periods, I've been in the States, I've been in Lithuania, I've been in Barcelona, there would always be a certain kind of homesickness that wasn't homesickness exactly, because whenever I come back here, I do sense a very deep frustration sometimes with the culture and with the history as well. More and more, I am coming to terms with the fact that my people are really just my own. So that's my family, that's my friends, that's my girlfriend. And whenever I get to spend some time with these people, there's a sense of belonging, and there's a sense of peace, and there's a sense of being known. And as long as I can maintain a healthy diet of that feeling of, yes, I am known, I'm seen, I'm loved, then I will maintain a feeling of home, I think, which is perhaps, maybe I'm just describing diaspora.
That's beautiful, and very much not what home is in The Safekeep.
No. Well, in a way. I think it's important to know. Maybe it isn't, but I think it's important to know that I started out my young years as a low-key as a hoarder. Not a big hoarder. I didn't have enough space to actually hoard, but I just moved out of my parents' place, and I thought that the way to exist in the world was to surround myself with as many things that felt like they were a projection of myself. So whenever I would be anywhere and I would see something, I was like, yes, that little rock feels like me. My sense of belonging at that time was very much tied to materiality and to making space feel like it was sort of two big hands cupping me and holding me safe. I had 6 different types of wallpaper on my wall. An oversensory nightmare now, but back then that's what I wanted.
So it's just so interesting that you say that about the little tchotchkes. That is so much of what I understood of Isabel's attachment to all of the different things. She was keeping records of the silverware and, marking what, and each of their sense of self was so tied to the house.
To things.
Yeah.
And
to the materialism and all of those things. I want to pick up on the magical stuff a little bit. And this, The Safekeep is not a magical book, but in some ways, I guess the thread of, I would say, almost like horror or suspense is there. I'm curious if you think about magic in relation to your book, or it's something separate that you're thinking about.
I think I had a few friends who read it before I'd sent it to anyone. So this was just me trying out the novel on different people and I didn't tell them anything about it. I was just like, here's a book, read it, tell me what you think. And because they didn't have the context and they didn't have a cover and they didn't have a blurb, right? I think usually you can tell a lot of things through those elements. They thought it was going to be a ghost story. because especially in the first few chapters, there's all these, doors are creaking, and it feels like it might be a ghost story, right? It feels like it might be a horror. And at one point I described it as a whodunit, where there's no who and the done it is the Holocaust, which is maybe a bit of an intense way of putting it, but it's sort of like it's that feeling, I think. And I think earlier I talked about, being a haunting myself. That I feel like sometimes I haunt this country with my very presence. And that's the feeling that I wanted to imbue into the book. This feeling like there's a haunting going on, but you're not quite sure why or what, where it comes from. And it's not exactly magic, and it's not exactly mysticism, but there is a ghost in one sense or another. And I think the mystery and mysticism are, as genres, oftentimes I think they're, one step to the left and you're already there. They're very connected.
I think that's absolutely right. The first page of the novel opens with Isabel digging up a plate. And I very much got the sense that this is your impulse in the book, right? To dig everything up. So I'm curious what it was that made you feel like you were the person to dig it all up.
Oh, absolutely nothing made me feel like I was the greatest person. No, it's everything tells you like who's waiting for this. No one wants this. Is this interesting? I think I wrote the first 3 chapters thinking this is the most boring book I've ever written or read. Who's going to want this? No, I think it's rather the other way around. You do it despite the fact that your inner voice is telling you, who are you anyway? I wrote it because it's a conversation I've been having with myself for years now, a conversation about the way that my culture, Dutch culture, but also Jewish culture, right? Because, I am as much Dutch as I am Jewish, and the Dutch side of me is not the Jewish side, and the Jewish side, they're separate and they're combined all the same. So it's me entering into a conversation with myself about the way that my culture, that culture, sort of deals with its own history and the silences, and even in trying to remember, even in trying to give history a space in society, within Dutch culture, it's still very much a narrative of those who belong and those who do not belong, the insider and the outsider. And it's been changing, but for years there was a narrative of the Dutch did very little wrong, and most of the people in the Netherlands were part of the resistance, and the perpetrators were the Germans. And there was very little talk of the collaboration that happened, very little talk of the incredibly high percentage of people who were deported from this country, one of the highest in the entirety of Europe. And very little talk of how the Jewish Dutch people were then received when they came back from the camps, and not just on a social level, but also on a financial level. Their houses, their property was taken from them because they hadn't been paying taxes while in the camps. They had to prove that they hadn't earned money in the camps so that they wouldn't have to pay taxes on the imaginary earned money in the camps. The way that bureaucracy was put in place as a form of violence. And perhaps also not, I talk about the Netherlands, but also just this idea of, the bureaucracy specifically. So the way that taxes were involved in both creating the camps, the way that the camps were made off the backs, off of dispossessed families. And then again, this violence was reenacted when they came back from the camps. I think that's a larger conversation that I haven't heard, not in the Netherlands, but just in general. So I knew, I knew that I wanted to have. No, actually, I didn't know I wanted to have this conversation. I actually didn't want to have this conversation. Then a friend of mine, I told her the idea for this premise, but I initially wanted to set it in England because I didn't want to deal with the Dutch story. I was like, I think I actively said, like, I don't want to write it about myself. I don't want to write it about my history and my family. I don't feel like it. I just want to have a little bit of a distance. And my friend was like, you need to sit down. You need to sit down in a corner and think about what you just said. And she convinced me to set it in the Netherlands after. I mean, of course, it would have been ridiculous to put it in England. I don't know how it would have worked, but yeah, no, she convinced me, and so I did it. God bless her.
Yes, God bless her. I think you have that insider outsider status, right? You're Dutch and Jewish, but like this particular Dutch Jewish story isn't your family's story. So you have like the distance and the insiderness to be the one to tell it. I do feel like what you were just talking about was something that, obviously so many of our families, our generations left their houses, their homes, their belongings from where they were and fled elsewhere. It wasn't something that I sort of had confronted in a reality. And the rage that the book sort of builds to was something that I found really unique for a book to engender that feeling. By the time you get to her story, that I just identified with a feeling of rage. And I'm just curious if that was what was motivating it. Was that the feeling you were hoping to engender in your readers?
I think if it was only rage, then the rest of the novel wouldn't have worked. If it was only rage, then I wouldn't have been able to write Isabel the way I wrote her. And if it was only rage, there wouldn't have been a love story. And there wouldn't have been... I think rage in itself would have not been an engine enough. It was not just rage. It was also a wanting to unpack something through Isabel. To unpack, because Isabel, I think there's... I've been asked a lot about sort of Isabel as a perpetrator, but I don't think she's she's complicit, but there's not that much agency to her complicity, right? She was a child. She witnessed something. She didn't fully understand what she witnessed. And she comes to understand what she has witnessed as she grows older, and she comes to understand the space that she occupies. And that doesn't mean that she doesn't have to deal with it, right? It doesn't mean that she hasn't done wrong in not asking more questions. It just means that it's a complicated position for her to be in. And I wanted through her to investigate both sort of like this feeling of confusion when you come into understanding. I am complicit in something. I have a responsibility toward history and toward the people who have been wronged. And to juxtapose that with a wall of rage, which is Eva. Because both of those things, like I said, they are within me, right? They are part of my own history and my own existence in this world. I'm not just the one thing, unfortunately. That would be nice and calming. But it is rage. I mean, I definitely felt it in writing the diary chapter, and I felt it in doing research. The more I found out, the more I was like, I remember there would be periods where I would read something about the reception of returning Jews, and I would just feel like I would just need a holiday. I would just need to get out of the Netherlands so I wouldn't be here anymore. But it wasn't just rage. With the ending, I wanted to take Isabel from a place of prejudice and a place of rejection and hatred toward certain people and toward ideas. And this is not just Eva, right? For Isabel, it's a whole world of outsiders who she considers with a lot of prejudice and a lot of repulsion. And I wanted to take that and turn it into desire. And the reason why I wanted to turn it into desire is because what has sort of driven my rage as a Jewish person in the Netherlands is not necessarily just the history and just the erasure and just the whole, right, the haunting and the ghostliness of it, but rather this fact that so many people disappeared and they were not wanted, in the sense of there was no desire for them to come back. There was no love on the flip side of repulsion. There was just repulsion, and then there was neutrality. And, the way that Jewish people in the Netherlands exist is sort of like there's a tolerance. There's okay, you may exist next to us, but I've never felt, and I know that's not how people work. That's not how communities work. I understand, but what you want when you have been rejected on the flip side is what you want is desire. And I don't think there's anything that I'm going to change, but it was something that I could create in the small space of a narrative. I could take a character from repulsion and I could take her into desire and make her say, come back to me. I want you here. I want you in this house with me. And that was me having a little theater play with myself. And that's, I think, what I wanted with the book, not just rage, but also desire.
I think it's desire, it's optimism, reconciliation, a little bit of all of that. And it's such a beautiful love story, and a queer love story in and of itself is such a beautiful thing to have written. I loved that it couldn't have existed any other way. It didn't feel like these characters were being true to themselves without you having told it just in the way that you told it. I was going to ask you about the ending, actually. I'm just going to find the quote here. You have the quote that's on the synagogue that Isabel passes, Ki ve'ti ve'tzvila yikare l'chol ha'amim. I'm curious why you ended with that quote and what that quote meant to you.
The quote ended up in the book is because that quote is genuinely on the synagogue in Zwolle. So when I was writing that chapter, I went to the synagogue and, of course, wrote down the quote and was like, well, we're going to have to, Isabel's going to have to respond to this quote in one way or another. And it was, of course, it wasn't a mistake that I made there, but I forgot that my book was going to be translated to different languages. And so I took the Hebrew and I translated it a little bit freely. There's many translations of that, right? There's many translations. I just chose a specific translation. It's translated as House of Devotion. And I want a devotion to come back again and again, because I think that's, that's this desire. I think what Isabel has come to know in opposition to, this cold life that she's been living, where the only devotion that she's had was toward the house, without being cheesy, right? She feels a devotion toward the house, and she feels devotion toward Eva, and she feels devotion toward the idea of Eva existing in the house. The way I wanted to end it, and I've talked to a lot of people who remember the last scene as being the scene in the kitchen, but then there's, of course, that one final paragraph when you see them the next morning, and there's a very small moment where Isabel turns toward Eva, and Eva offers her a kiss. And Isabel takes the kiss. And the reason why I wanted to do that is I knew this from the very beginning. I wanted the novel to end with Eva offering something to Isabel and Isabel accepting it, because this is the way that I see forgiveness. Because I think that in general, when we talk about reconciliation, when we talk about apologies in general, the focus is oftentimes on the gesture of apologizing as the act of apology. But really, there's so many other factors. And I think a major factor is the fact that there needs to be another person on the receiving end, and they need to receive that apology. And receiving an apology or accepting an apology, in my eyes, is a gift. That is something that you do for another person. And that, I think that's why it can also be an incredibly difficult thing, because, somebody has done you wrong, then they apologize, and then you need to give them something else on top of the thing that they've already taken from you, right? And so it can be incredibly vulnerable, I think, to accept an apology, and it's invulnerable also to give an apology. So both parties, right, are in such a precarious situation. And so I wanted to end it on Eva offering something to Isabel as a show of like, this is the gift that I'm giving you, the gift of seeing your apology. I don't know if, there's an acceptance of it, but I received the apology. This is a gift, which is, very theoretical and very meta. And it's just something that I wanted to do for myself, and not, it's not something that a reader needs to pick up on. It's just, an emotion that I wanted to put into that final sentence. And so to end it after that gift, I wanted to end it on the notion of devotion and devotion in the house, the notion of like where it can take you and what kind of futures it can create. And which of course begs the question of, can it exist outside the bounds of the house? Will they survive when they leave the house? And that is up to the reader, of course, to decide. But yeah, that was the thought behind the ending.
It's beautiful. I think it's a perfect ending, especially even just the L'chol ha'amim is, also just an inclusive note. And I thought it was, in the way that the best books can be read as metaphor, I just thought it was a particularly poignant ending to end with a note of reconciliation and optimism. So thank you so much for joining me, Yael. This was a really
Thank you so much, Sally. Thank you for the interview.
Thank you.
For your beautiful questions. I had a lovely time.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today for the 5 books. Our guest today was Yael van der Wouden talking about her brilliant new book, The Safekeep. You can find a link to the book in our show notes. If you enjoyed the show, please be sure to subscribe and share with friends and family. You can find all the books recommended today in our show notes. I'm Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen. Our producer is Odelia Rubin. Music by Dove Rosenblatt and Blue Dot Sessions. Art by Dina Friedman. Special thank you to the Jewish Book Council, to Lauren Ween, Morgan Swift, Jeff Umbro, and Odelia Rubin.